Noble motives, evil actions. It is important to again stress the fact of those who become law enforcers and soldiers, most do so out of a desire to fight for justice. Nonetheless, because of their belief in authority, their noble intentions often end up being used to harm the innocent and protect the guilty. Because a police officer is supposed to enforce the law and a soldier is supposed to follow orders, their own values and intentions get trumped by the agendas of those giving orders. Notwithstanding the military recruiting propaganda encouraging young men and women to fight up to join for truth and justice, the true job of a soldier is to kill whomever the master tells him to kill. It is as simple as that. How many Americans on their own choose to go to foreign lands and kill complete strangers? Very few. How many Americans on their own, if they were in a foreign land, would feel justified in going door to door, interrogating strangers at gunpoint, invading and searching their homes because they thought some truly bad person might be in the area? Very few. These are actions which almost every individual's sense of morality would tell him are wrong. But when someone voluntarily joins an authoritarian military, he intentionally shuts off his own judgment and conscience in favor of simply doing as he is told. Though soldiers sometimes use legitimate force, such as combating aggressors and invaders, they also routinely act as aggressors and invaders themselves. It would be impossible for a government military to function any other way. Imagine an army going door to door politely asking each homeowner for permission to cross his land. Simply calling the situation war causes the believers in government to imagine that the usual standards of human behavior do not apply. Under the excuse of necessity, soldiers trespass, steal, intimidate, threaten, assault, interrogate, torture, and murder. And they do this even against the people they consider to be their allies. The military and occupation of Iraq by mercenaries of the US government, which was purportedly done to defend the people of Iraq, was an example of a large scale invasion and coercion, and thus was immoral, even if it displaced a regime guilty of an even worse level of intimidation and murder, the regime of Saddam Hussein. Yet the supposed evil of the enemy is often cited as a justification for authoritarian coercion. In truth, today and throughout history, large-scale violence against innocents has always been done in the name of fighting for freedom or fighting against injustice. Even when the Nazis invaded Poland, they first staged a series of false flag events and propaganda stunts, collectively known as Operation Himmler, so they could pretend that the invasion was a justified act of self-defense. The truth is that, even when the evil of an enemy regime is easy to see, making the overall fight seem righteous to one side, the violence committed by authoritarian militaries is never directed only at the actual aggressors on the other side. The structure and methodology of hierarchical armies make it so that innocents are always victimized by one way or another, and not just by accident, but by design. The pack mentality that is such a big part of patriotism makes this unavoidable. In World War II, the American troops saw the Krauts and the Japs as the enemy, rather than seeing the enemy as those individuals who actually committed acts of aggression against innocent people, a concept which would require each soldier to constantly use his own individual perception and moral judgment to assess each situation as he confronted it, which is incompatible with the authoritarian chain of command. Of course, of the people who fit the definition of the Krauts, the Germans, or the Japs, the Japanese, many played no part in the conflict aside from funding it through paying taxes, as discussed below. But on both sides in every war, government militaries and the propaganda they use always target and demonize a general category of people rather than just the individuals who have actually initiated violence. The result is that huge demographic groups end up being ordered to subjugate or exterminate each other, making it so that neither side is ever the good guy in any war between nations, as both militaries always use violence against innocent people as well as against other soldiers. Perhaps one of the most heinous examples of this was the dropping of nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which constituted by far the two worst individual acts of terrorism and mass murder in history. Together, they resulted in the deaths of around 200,000 civilians, about 70 times worse than the number of deaths from the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. The admitted goal was to inflict pain, and death on the population of an entire country in order to coerce the ruling class of that country to bend to the will of another ruling class. Ironically, this fits perfectly the United States government's own definition of terrorism, except that definition conveniently exempts acts that are legal and or committed by governments. If those in government advocate and carry out violent activities and are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, then it is considered legitimate and just. If anyone else does the exact same thing, it is terrorism. See Section 2331 of Title 18 of the United States Code. As an aside, the existence of nuclear weapons is entirely the result of the belief in authority. Unlike many weapons, it is impossible to use them for purely defensive purposes. The only reason the nuclear bomb was invented and manufactured in the first place was because of an authoritarian nationalistic pact mentality idea that it is possible and righteous to be at war with an entire country, and that therefore indiscriminately exterminating thousands of people at once can be justified. Being a member of a government military requires one to contribute to anti-human acts, even if only indirectly, regardless of whatever noble motives the individual may have had for joining the armed forces. The reason is simple. Acting based on one's own perception and judgment and abiding by one's own conscience and one's own sense of right and wrong, it is utterly incompatible with being a member of any government military. Sadly, the result is that both sides of every war are wrong, in that they both initiate violence against innocents. At the same time, both sides of every war are also right in that they condemn the other side for initiating violence against innocents. In short, as long as there are soldiers willing to subjugate themselves to a claimed authority and even to commit murder when it tells them to do so, lasting peace will be impossible. Those who fight for any government, even if they believe they are fighting for their country, can never achieve justice and freedom, because a ruling class, by its very nature, never wants freedom and justice even for its own subjects, or it would cease to exist. However noble their motives and however courageous their actions, ultimately, the only thing government soldiers can ever achieve is subjugation and domination. Ironically, probably in an attempt to hide the inherent evil nature of every government military and to distinguish its own mercenaries from the mercenaries of other tyrannical regimes, the U.S. military pretends that American soldiers have the right and duty to disobey any order they deem to be illegal or immoral. However, not only is any soldier who does so likely to be court-martialed, but such a principle, which by itself would be quite proper, goes directly against the entire concept of authority and against the specific methods used to train soldiers to be unthinking, obedient tools of the regime they serve. In a combat setting, nearly everything that every government military does constitutes aggressive terrorism, and almost every order a soldier receives is an immoral order, whether it is to trespass on someone else's property, blow up a bridge, block a road, disarm civilians, detain and interrogate people without justification, or kill complete strangers just on the say-so of a supposed authority. In fact, even when the rules of engagement are only to fire if fired upon, that is still often unjustified. When one is the aggressor, whether individually or acting on behalf of authority, the target of aggression has the right to use whatever force is necessary to stop the aggressor. In other words, a lot of situations, shooting at soldiers, including American soldiers, is inherently justified. Killing someone for defending himself against aggressors is murder, even when the aggressors are U.S. soldiers. And almost every soldier routinely commits immoral acts of aggression, believing that commands from authority make it okay for him to do so. If any soldier actually took seriously the idea that he had the duty to disobey an immoral order, the first thing he would do would be to quit the military. Those who act as mercenaries for government, even if they do so with the best of intentions, will always be part of a machine that commits aggression as often as, or more than, it defends the innocent. That being the case, nearly every combat soldier does things which justify the use of defensive violence against him. However, However, as conquering invaders always have, the American military commanders label anyone who resists their acts of aggression as an enemy combatant, an insurgent, or a terrorist. When aggression is committed in the name of authority, many then view any act of self-defense against such aggression as a sin. As much as American authoritarians might be outraged at the suggestion, the truth is that many thousands of people the world over have had good cause to shoot at American soldiers. When a person who has not harmed or threatened anyone is in his home minding his own business, and heavily armed thugs break down his door, point machine guns at him and his family, threatening and ordering them around, the homeowner has the absolute right to protect himself and his family by any means necessary, including the armed intruders. The average American, if he were the victim of such assault by foreign mercenaries, would feel perfectly justified in using whatever violence was necessary to repel the attackers. But if his fellow Americans were the ones committing such assaults in a foreign land, that same American, having been steeped in authority worship and pack mentality, will support the troops and will cheer when an American soldier murders a homeowner who attempts to forcibly resist such aggression and thuggery. Authoritarian military actions are never purely defensive. When governments declare war, it is never to defend the innocent or to preserve freedom, though that is always the stated purpose. When governments engage in war, it is always to protect or add to the territory or other resources controlled by that government. The ruling class, by its very nature, does not even want its own subjects to be free, much less the subjects of some foreign ruler. As a result, though one side, though as a result, though one who dies in combat is often said to have given his life for his country, in reality, those who die in war are simply resources spent by tyrants on various turf wars with other competing gangs of tyrants. The people are fed propaganda about heroism, sacrifice, patriotism, to hide the fact that governments never enter wars to serve justice or freedom. They do it to serve their own power. An objective examination of history makes this obvious. Even one of the most apparently justifiable military endeavors in history, the Allies in World War II fighting against the Axis powers, while it resulted in the defeat of the third worst mass murderer in history, Adolf Hitler, it also resulted in the worst mass murderer in history, Joseph Stalin, essentially being given half of Europe by the rulers of the Allied nations. The motive of most of American soldiers who fought in the war was undoubtedly to protect the good from the evil, but the motives of those who commanded them and therefore the actual results of the brave soldiers' efforts was nothing more than an authoritarian conquest and power. In World War II, one could have at least suggested, with some imagination, the possibility of an invasion of the United States and thereby claim that it was an act of self-defense because national security was at stake. But most U.S. military operations have involved no direct threat to the U.S. 30-some thousand Americans died in the North Korean War. No one imagined North Korea was going to invade the U.S. 50-some thousand Americans died in the Vietnam War. No one imagined that Northern Vietnam was going to invade the U.S. No one imagined that the armies of Iraq or Afghanistan were going to invade the U.S. The excuse for such conflicts has always been a vague cause, such as fighting communism, or even more of an excuse of having a war on terror, which is made more ironic by the fact that terrorist tactics were and continue to be routinely used by U.S. forces. The sad irony is that the American ruling class, because of the legitimacy its victims imagine it to have, is the only gang actually capable of conquering and subjugating the American people. The gigantic military machine and all of the war games it has engaged in, rather than providing a shred of real protection for the American public, is what created most existing foreign threats, and what is still used as the excuse to justify the oppression of Americans by their own government via the Orwellian named Patriot Act, among other things. The popular bumper sticker always says, "If you love your freedom, thank a veteran." It's a continuing symptom of the pack mentality, state-worshipping propaganda that the ruling class feeds to their subjects so that the masters will continue to have pawns to play in their sadistic, destructive power games. Even when a slave master fights to prevent some other slave master from stealing his slaves, he is still no friend to the slaves themselves. It is quite understandable that someone who has risked his life, gone through hell, harmed or killed other human beings, possibly including innocents, and suffered physical or emotional trauma as a result, would be reluctant to accept that all his courage, his suffering, and the damage he inflicted on others ultimately served only the schemes of megalomaniacs. However, even some of the most famous military personalities in history have eventually come to acknowledge that governments engage in war not for any noble purpose, but for profits and power. Major General Smedley Butler, who at the time of his death in 1940 was the most decorated U.S. Marine in history, wrote a book titled War's a Racket that characterized the military-industrial complex, saying that war is conducted for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, even going as far as to describe his own military service as the actions of high-class musclemen, a racketeer, and a gangster. Likewise, General Douglas MacArthur opined that military expansion was driven by an artificially induced psychosis of war hysteria and an incessant propaganda of fear. General MacArthur also said the following: "The powers in charge keep us in a perpetual state of fear, keeping us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fever with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it by furnishing the exorbitant sums demanded. Yet, in retrospect, these disasters seem never to have happened, seem never to have been quite real." Of course, to criticize war as a racket which benefits only the ruling class is not to say that the ruling class on the other side is not also evil or should not be resisted. The atrocities committed by enforcers of the regimes of Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Lenin, Pol Pot, and many others were extremely serious, and the use of defensive violence against those acts of aggression committed by the agents of some regimes was certainly justified. But authoritarian warfare pits pawn against pawn in a large-scale body combat, which covers huge geographical areas, always victimizing civilian populations in the process, while the ruling classes on both sides watch from a safe distance. Further evidence that war is never about ideals or principles is the fact that the US government has often waged war against tyrants it put into place, such as Manuel Noriega and Saddam Hussein. And even a more blatant example of how war is not just about principles is the fact that at the beginning of World War II, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union were sworn enemies of the United States. By the end of the war, the psychotic mass murderer was referred to as Uncle Joe by the US government propagandists and was treated as a noble ally. Stalin's crimes against humanity, resulting in tens of millions of deaths, went largely unmentioned in the US at the time. In fact, in light of the fact, it is absurd to claim that the US government decided to enter World War II based on any moral principle or to defeat evil. It is important to note what does and what does not occur in traditional international warfare. Competing ruling classes, including the American rulers, are content to watch their respective pawns slaughter each other by the thousands, but it has often been a policy of many governments, including the US government, not to kill foreign rulers, i.e., the ones most responsible for making the war happen. In truth, the most moral, most rational, and most cost-effective means of defending against an invading authority is the assassination of those who command it. Targeting governments instead of their loyal enforcers would serve humanity wonderfully, not only ending most violent conflicts a lot more quickly, but creating a huge deterrent to any megalomaniac tempted to start conflicts in the first place. Yet there is an open, mutual standing agreement between most high-level tyrants that, while it is okay to play games with the lives of their subjects, they will rarely target each other. And so, over and over again, huge numbers of soldiers march out into the battlefields to kill each other, while the real enemies of humanity, the rulers on both sides, remain out of harm's way. Thus, the lives of well-intentioned soldiers, the brave government enforcers who loyally follow orders to the bitter end, are utterly wasted in endeavors which, by design, ultimately achieve real freedom and justice for no one. And if a soldier manages to recognize and target the ones most responsible for injustice and oppression, those who wear the label of government on both sides in every war, he is condemned as a traitor and a terrorist.